As a child, I loved Easter and Christmas. Christmas is all about the presents. Easter is all about the chocolate and the candy. From Easter egg hunts in my grandmother's backyard and the bonus one you would get at church, to the Easter basket that would somehow be there in my room after we got home. Easter was a time to get more stuff. Now, I've grown up now, and I'm a parent, and I have to tell you that my joy is a little bit diminished. As an adult, I can buy candy, and I can buy stuff anytime I want, right? And how many of you go to Rite Aid and Food Lion today, and you get that Easter candy for about 75% off? But the biggest joy stealer I have at the holidays is the cleanup. At Christmas, it's the wrapping paper and the boxes and the big plastic bags full of packaging that fill up my trash cans. At Easter, it's the sharp halves of those plastic Easter eggs that you step on in the middle of the night, right? Or maybe it's the crinkled candy wrappers that are found throughout the house. Or, my worst thing, the green plastic grass. There's nothing like sitting on the floor with your vacuum cleaner and a screwdriver trying to get that green plastic grass out of your vacuum cleaner, right? My joy in these holidays is also diminished a little bit as a pastor. One thing I now worry about is what do I do with all these flowers that aren't picked up after the last service? You know how many poinsettias we've planted in the backyard and that have died in the last 6 months or 6 years? Why do we have this excess? Why have our celebrations of these two most important Christian holidays turned into a time to buy more stuff? Why do we have the waste of Christmas? Why do we have the waste of Easter? Preaching professor and minister Fred Craddock once spoke about a scandal that erupted at a church that he and his wife attended. Now, don't worry, it's not one of those scandals that I have to put an R rating on a sermon. No minister or congregants were harmed in the making of this sermon. No money disappeared from the offering plate. And yet what happened at that church that one Easter ended a tradition that had lasted over 15 years. See, Reverend Craddock said that the church placed 500 lilies in the church on Easter Sunday. Can you imagine? I mean, we only have about 11. 500 Easter lilies in their sanctuary. Some years the lilies would be arranged in a cross in front of the altar. Other years they would be haphazardly scattered around the sanctuary, decorating everything. Year after year, 500 blooming lilies would demonstrate the truth that Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Now, year after year, these lilies made for a beautiful Easter, and families would have their portraits taken in front of all those Easter lilies, and this is the days before Facebook, so things would be in black and white in the church newsletter, but you would have all these families with their pictures on Easter Sunday. Now, part of this tradition also included listing names in the bulletin. You could, for $5, you could put the name of your loved one in there, and you could be in memoriam or in honor of. So for over 15 years, 500 names were printed in the bulletin on Easter Sunday for $5 apiece. Now, the scandal erupted in the 16th year of this tradition. It's a surprise, actually, that it didn't happen earlier. The 500 lilies were placed as usual. The church was celebrating Easter, and everything was going fine until one of the older congregants came up to the front of the church and asked an usher, well, do you mind if I take one of these lilies to my friend in the hospital? She wasn't able to make it to church today, and I thought she might enjoy one of these lilies. Well, nobody told her no. And so she came up to the front of the church after the service. And as she proceeded to pick up the lily, her shocked shout could be heard by all who remained in place after that service. "They're plastic!" she shouted. And that is when the scandal began. It was small to begin with. A few murmurs here and there turned into phone calls on the phone tree, turned into gossip at the diner, turned into informal coffee cup meetings in between services and parking lot conclaves after church council, until finally a month later, the minister and the elders were brought in front of a formal church council committee to be interrogated about the use of plastic flowers in the church. In addition, the gossip turned to the age of these plastic flowers. Were they purchased every year, or were these the same flowers that they had bought 15 years earlier? Well, an accountant quickly pulled out his calculator. A math teacher pulled out his pen and pencil, and they sat down there and they huddled. 15 years, $5 each, 500 names. And they quickly came up with a figure of $37,500. Now, in defense of using plastic flowers for Easter, the minister explained that they were kept in a cool, dark place and they were covered with plastic. And wasn't it amazing how even after 15 years the flowers looked as beautiful as they did that first year? So the committee then asked the next question, well, what did you do with all that money? Well, the minister and the elders who had made that decision said that they had put it all in a contingency fund. Some of it had been used to fix the boiler that had broken down a couple of years earlier, and other monies had been used to help transients as they came through, or families in the church who needed help. And they said, you know, that $35,000 of that $37,500 has gone out of this church to help our community. Well, many on the committee shook their heads and said, that's a great idea. And they could see the wisdom in what the minister had done, what the elders had put in their forethought of that. But a few, deep down in their heart, even though they never said it, were still upset that they were using fake flowers in a church. So the minister turned to his second argument, a little more theological maybe. He said, plastic lilies are appropriate. After all, they're always in bloom, and they will never die. And after all, we don't really want to waste Easter, do we? You know, in some ways, he's right. We don't want the waste of Easter. We don't want to put all our faith in stuff. It really is an awful thing to squander the stuff that we have, whether they're beautiful flowers, or the tons of chocolate that we like to eat, or even the leftover lonely lilies that last after the 11 o'clock service. But you know, I think that minister was also wrong. You see, we can't really comprehend the resurrection without understanding that Jesus had really died. We don't know the joy of Easter when we forget about the pain of Good Friday. You see, Jesus was dead. You can ask the centurion who saw him die on that hill. You can ask the women who prepared his body for burial. You can ask the disciples who watched that event from far off. You can ask Joseph of Arimathea, who had Jesus' body brought to the tomb. They will tell you Jesus was dead. When Mary discovered the empty tomb and John and Peter ran to see it for themselves, they weren't expecting miracles. In fact, Jesus said to the two disciples, they took his body. She wasn't expecting life there. She wasn't expecting an empty tomb. She could only see the loss of Jesus. The two disciples, on going to the tomb, stepped in and they saw the linen and the cloth that had been on Jesus' face, and they were so stunned they returned home. They weren't expecting a resurrection. They were expecting a body. They were expecting death. And Mary, weeping in the garden, lost in her grief, did not even recognize Jesus, at least until he called her name. You know, I think we waste Easter when we only focus on the good things. So often in our modern church, we move from the celebration of Palm Sunday to the celebration of Easter, and we don't stop to think of all that has happened in between. We forget the crowd that turned on Jesus and shouted, "Crucify, crucify." We forget the betrayal and the denial and the fear of the Jesus' disciples. We forget that even we have left Jesus to die on the cross by himself. In our modern celebration of Jesus, we celebrate angels singing to the shepherds watching their flocks. And then a few weeks later, we come back to celebrate Jesus risen from the dead. But what about the rest of the story? Have we thrown that out with the flowers? And the poinsettias? Easter without Good Friday is not Easter. Christmas without remembering the cross is not Christmas. Faith absent belief in the resurrection is not Christianity. In the same way, there is no forgiveness without confession. There is no salvation without repentance. And what we're reminded to do on this Easter Sunday is to walk in the shoes of Mary and the disciples. That journey on that morning, that Sunday morning, was not one filled with joy. There was no way that Mary was prepared to see the sunrise in the same way that we come to see the sunrise on Easter morning. You see, Mary woke up before dawn, prepared to weep and to mourn and to prepare a body. Mary woke up to face death. And when she discovered the tomb was empty, her grief turned to shock, and she lost Jesus for a second time. There was not even a body to mourn over. Now, Mary and John and Peter, they're what I like to call the Saturday people. They're the ones that were still lost in grief over Jesus. And have you ever wondered what it would have been like to be there, to be one of those disciples that saw your master taken away and then crucified, and then he died, and you're sitting there in shock on those days in between, wondering what's going to happen next? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be a Saturday person, worried about the future, guilty over your abandonment of Jesus, your faith devastated by the death of an idea and the man that taught us that idea? Well, the truth is, there are many people in this world who are living as Saturday people. There are many who grieve their loss, who live without hope, who struggle to even just make it day by day. They have no understanding of what resurrection can be. And you know what? It's a waste of Easter when we don't and we can't remember what it's like to be without God. Now, if you're like me, maybe you've had some of these thoughts. And see, I thought I knew what love was before I got married, and nearly 16 years into a marriage, I'm still learning what it's supposed to be. I thought I knew what loss was, but as I get older and lose more people, I'm still discovering how deep grief can go. I thought I knew what sin was, but as I've lived longer and learned more and talked to more of you guys, I realize that I'm still trying to figure it out. I can still get caught being cynical about government and politics. Any of y'all guilty of that? I complain about violence that people do to one another, and I feel hopeless and helpless. I get angry at injustice in all of its forms and at myself for not having the power to change anything. And you see, without resurrection, we can let all of our doubts and our fears and our angers and our frustrations rule over us. You see, without resurrection, we can pursue stuff. And we try to use that stuff to fill the God-shaped hole in our hearts. Without resurrection, we are like the plastic lilies, always looking good, but never really being alive. It's a waste of Easter when we forget that death was overcome. It's a waste of Easter when we fill our lives with with a faith that's only skin deep. And you know, we can get stuck living in that Saturday mentality, wallowing in all that is lost. But you know what? When we have resurrection, I'm still surprised by God's amazing grace. With every loss I experience, with every stubborn sin I face, I'm amazed by the love that God still shows me. And maybe that's what Easter is supposed to do for us. It's supposed to remind us of all that God risks for us. It's supposed to remind us of all that can be lost and then all that can be gained. Like Mary, we can be surprised by Jesus calling our name. Like John and Peter and the other disciples, we can be amazed by the scarred hands and the pierced side of Jesus as he physically returns to us in the upper room. You see, we are not Saturday people. We are Easter people. And as Easter people, we don't have to be weighed down by all the stuff we try to carry with us. We don't need to waste Easter. We don't need the waste of Easter. We don't need the plastic lilies to tell us what is beautiful. We also don't need the plastic eggs, the plastic grass, or all the other plastic stuff that we fill our lives with to tell us that we are worth something to God. We don't have to carry our grief and our loss to be worthy of God's love. All we need is the grace of God to set us free and make us alive. We are people who live in the reality of a resurrected God. So as we go out into the world today, remember all that was risked on that cross. And remember that Christ has died. Christ is risen. And Christ will come again. Amen.